The movie kicks off by showing us a peek into Donald's life. He's a hard-working farmer who takes care of his elderly mom, Florence, and looks after their farm. In his free time, he helps his neighbor fix their car without expecting any money in return. Surprisingly, the neighbor gives Donald an old RV, thinking he can fix it up and make some money. While Donald is at his neighbor's place, they encourage him to break away from his daily routine and have some fun outside. But Donald feels a strong connection to his mom and can't bear to leave her alone. As the night goes on, Florence reads the obituaries in the newspaper and feels sad seeing so many people she knows have passed away. She worries, but Donald offers to stay with her for comfort. Still, Florence insists that he should go out and enjoy life's pleasures. Donald heads to a bar and tries to ask the bartender out. Trouble starts when a bunch of drunk guys make a mess, and one of them starts bothering the bartender. Donald steps in to help, but one guy starts making fun of him for living with his mom. Just before things get worse, the bartender kicks the troublemaker out. Donald leaves the bar and goes back to the old RV. He looks around and decides to make it his new home. For days, he works really hard on fixing it up until it's running smoothly. He takes Florence to see the refurbished RV, hoping to take her on a trip to a place she and his dad used to love, but she gets upset and refuses. Later on, she feels bad about it and brings him a pack of beer to make up for it. Donald drinks the beer and goes to bed. That night, he has a weird dream where he's in a forest, and suddenly his mom appears in front of him. He calls out to her, but she screams for help, and that wakes him up. Donald gets a bad feeling, so he leaves the RV and sees a mysterious figure in a cloak, Slenderman, walking away from his house and getting into a car. Donald rushes inside and finds his mom's lifeless body on the ground. He calls 911, and the police come to talk to him about what happened. Donald tells them about the two guys leaving the house, but the cops don't seem to believe him and give him a hard time. A few days later, they have a gathering to remember Florence, and Donald's uncle Eamon comes over along with a few other people. Then, a few days after that, Donald's in the front yard, and he sees a car speeding away from his gate when they notice him. The next night, Donald is in his mom's room trying to tidy things up when he hears a noise from the barn. He grabs his shotgun and goes to check it out, but two masked guys surprise him. They make him drop his shotgun and try to make it look like he killed himself. They put a noose around his neck, but they didn't do it right, and Donald ends up on his feet. They make him step aside so they can fix their mistake. Donald seizes the moment and grabs a hefty sledgehammer. He attacks one of the men, and they start grappling with each other. Donald eventually gains the upper hand and uses the sledgehammer to fatally strike the man's head. He then punches the other guy, knocking him to the ground, and takes off his mask, revealing a frightened young boy. The boy admits they were sent to kill Donald and make it look like an accident, but he doesn't have any more information to offer. Donald thinks about calling the police, but changes his mind when he stands at the spot where his mother was killed. Instead, he persuades the young boy, Bartos, to lie to his boss and say they completed the job. They arrange to meet the next day. Donald buries the deceased man in his backyard, grabs a bag, and hops into his RV with Bartos tied up and silenced. Donald hits the road, and after a while, he pulls over to interrogate Bartos about his mother's death. However, the lad has no clue who killed her. Bartos reveals that he was forced into this job because some men kidnapped his sister and are threatening to harm her. Donald desires vengeance for his mother's death and convinces Bartos to join him and also rescue his sister Kaya, to which Bartos agrees. They reach the meeting spot and spot a van pulling up with Kaya inside. Donald grabs his shotgun and the two head to the bar. Bartos goes in through the front, where he meets Gavigan and Jerome, the guys who sent him to kill Donald. Gavigan asks about the second guy and proof that the job's done. Bartos insists the evidence is on the other guy's phone. Bartos just wants to see his sister, but Gavigan reveals that the girl is another kidnapped one who tried to escape. Jerome holds Bartos, and Gavigan takes out a hammer and kills her. Donald, who came in from the back, sees Jerome getting rid of the girl's body and locks him inside a room. He quickly surprises Gavigan and holds him at gunpoint, making him drop the hammer. Donald realizes Gavigan isn't Florence's killer, but thinks he might know something. Donald forces him out of the building at gunpoint and tosses him into the van, unconscious. They drive into the forest, and Donald cooks a meal for himself and Bartos. Gavigan eventually wakes up, and Donald tries to get him to talk, wanting to know why they killed his mother. But Gavigan starts insulting Florence. In anger, Donald presses a hot pot against Gavigan's forehead, burning his skin and making him scream in pain. After a while, Gavigan starts crying and confesses that someone higher up wanted Donald dead. So they sent two guys, a man named Trevor and the driver, who turns out to be Gavigan's boss, Frankie. Donald tries to figure out why they'd want Florence dead, thinking maybe they were just trying to rob her. But Gavigan has no clue. Donald steps out of the van to take a leak, and Gavigan uses the chance to attack Bartos and make a run for it. Donald grabs his shotgun, and he and Bartos go after him. Gavigan somehow manages to free his hands and contacts Trevor, telling him that Donald is still alive. In the car with Trevor is Frankie, who, surprise, turns out to be a woman. They both start worrying. Back in the forest, Gavigan surprises Bartos and beats him up, threatening to harm his sister. Donald suddenly appears, distracting Gavigan, and Bartos manages to stab him. Gavigan starts whimpering, begging for help, but he soon dies from his wound. Jerome eventually breaks free and tells Frankie that Bartos is searching for his sister, but they can't find her because they don't know her name. Frankie gets mad at their screw-up and tells Trevor to personally find the girl. Donald and Bartos bury Gavigan in the forest when Gavigan's phone rings. It's Frankie urging Donald to stop before anyone else gets hurt. Donald just wants to know why they killed his mom, but Frankie hints that Florence was involved in something serious and had been a target for years. Donald doesn't fully understand, but warns Frankie that now there's a target on her back before hanging up. Donald goes to Uncle Eamon's place, showing him a picture he found in Florence's room of a man who isn't his dad. Eamon reluctantly explains that after Donald's dad passed away, a guy named Joe helped Florence for a while. Eamon points out Joe's daughter, who turns out to be Frankie. Donald learns that Joe got mixed up with some dangerous people, and despite Florence's efforts to protect him, he was eventually killed. Donald goes back to the van, and he asks Bartos to search for info about a guy named Joe. They discover that Joe was connected to some political murders, but it doesn't make sense why Florence would get killed over it. Donald is determined to find Frankie and get some answers. Bartos drops a bombshell and tells Donald that Kaya knows where Frankie's hideout is. Finding Kaya might lead them straight to Frankie. They hatch a plan where Donald pretends to be interested in some shady stuff involving young girls. He asks to meet Kaya, who now goes by the name Alicia, and they arrange to meet at a hotel at 6. Donald and Bartos head to the place, and Donald dresses up in a suit. He goes to the building, talks to a guard, and hands over some money, getting directions to a room. Donald is looking around when he comes face to face with Kaya. At first, she's really scared and doesn't believe Donald is working with Bartos. But when she hears her brother's voice on the phone, she calms down and trusts Donald. They create a distraction, and Donald takes out the guard. Donald asks Kaya about Frankie's whereabouts, but he realizes Bartos lied, and Kaya has no idea. Donald doesn't waste time and goes back to the guard, demanding to know where Frankie is. The guy won't talk, so Donald uses a hot iron to make him spill the beans, pressing it against his crotch until he talks. Meanwhile, Bartos is distracted outside and doesn't notice Jerome sneaking into the building. Donald gets the info and is about to leave when they run into Jerome, and a big fight breaks out. They brawl until they're both bloody, but just as Jerome is about to win, Kata shoots him dead and helps Donald out of the building. The two siblings embrace, happy to see each other again before driving off in the van. A little while later, Frankie and Trevor reach the building and find Jerome dead and the guard in agony. The guard swears he didn't spill any beans about Frankie, but Frankie uses the iron to kill him. Eventually, Donald recovers, and the three of them head to the address the guard gave them, keeping watch outside. Donald figures Frankie believes Florence had something to do with her dad's death, but he's sure she's mistaken. Donald spots Trevor leaving the place and tails him to Frankie's house, where he sees them talking. Donald gets ready to take action but changes his mind when he sees Frankie's daughter with her. On their way back to their camping spot, they almost get attacked by a gunman but manage to escape unharmed. Bartos thinks Donald should stop and suggests Florence might not be as innocent as he thinks. Donald pulls over and things get tense as he almost fights with Bartos over his comments. He tells them both to leave for pitying Frankie. Frankie is at home when she gets a call from the gunman telling her about his mistake. She blames Trevor for not getting rid of Donald earlier. even though he warned her not to kill Florence, and she fires him on the spot, ordering him to leave. Donald arrives at Eamon's place and finds it covered in blood, with Eamon beaten upstairs. Eamon begs Donald to stop going after Frankie and to call it even with her death. He reveals to a tearful Donald that Florence had an affair with Joe. When Joe's enemies threatened young Donald, Florence betrayed Joe to protect her family. Eamon urges Donald to put an end to the cycle of revenge before he passes away. Donald gazes out the window and spots Frankie's car pulling up outside. Frankie sees Donald's van and sends one of her guys to kill Eamon and Donald. After a while, Frankie hears nothing from her hitman and decides to go in herself. She discovers Eamon's and her shooter's lifeless bodies, but is too slow to realize that Donald has ambushed her. Donald holds her at gunpoint, takes away her weapon, and makes her get into his van. Donald drives Frankie to the beach where her father was killed. Meanwhile, Trevor is alone in a store when he gets a call about Donald kidnapping Frankie. Bartos and Kaya have found a place to rest, but Bartos is worried about Donald, so he heads out to look for him. He arrives at Eamon's place armed but finds Trevor there, calm and asking for Frankie. Bartos warns that Donald might kill Frankie and unwisely tells Trevor that he's leaving only to get ambushed and knocked out. The next morning, Donald shows Frankie a picture of Florence and her father, trying to explain why Florence did what she did. He starts leading her to a grave he dug. Meanwhile, Frankie explains that someone shot her father before his enemies arrived to finish him off, and she believes Florence did it. Donald refuses to believe it until Frankie reveals that she talked to Florence before she died. In reality, Florence was deeply in love with Joe to the point that she put him above her own family. But when Joe decided to end things and stay with his family, Florence couldn't handle it, and her jealousy led her to shoot him. Then she called Leo to help cover it up. Hearing this, Donald hesitates, struggling to pull the trigger. Frankie reminds him of the daughter she's leaving behind, and eventually, Donald stops himself from killing her as he turns to leave. Frankie attacks him with the shovel he used to dig her grave and tries to escape. She manages to break free, grabs a gun, but Donald shoots her dead. Donald finally picks up his ringing phone, which has been going off all evening. He thinks it might be Bartos, but it turns out to be Trevor. Donald pleads with Trevor not to harm Bartos, even offering to give himself up instead. Donald asks to talk to Bartos, and Trevor hands over the phone. Bartos can barely say goodbye before Trevor shoots him dead, telling Donald to come and find him. The movie ends with Donald standing on the beach, in shock and seething with anger. So, the moral of the story is sometimes it's better to fix up an old RV and embark on a crazy revenge journey with a kidnapped criminal than to hold onto your grudges and answer unknown phone calls.